Hello, welcome, and good evening. My name is Fabio Gigi. I'm the chair of the Japan Research Center here at SOAS, and it's a great pleasure to be chairing the event here tonight. Du lebst und tust mir nichts. You're alive, and yet you do me no harm. This is how Aby Warburg describes the effect of the image. It is there, it is a presence, and yet somehow it cannot quite reach out and touch you and harm you. So it's a very fitting point of departure to introduce Tomoë Steineck, Dr. Tomoë Steineck, whose scholarship has persistently examined precisely this tension, how images in Japanese religious history act, endure, are contested, and are redefined. Her early work include Die Struktur des bildlichen Ausdrucks im geheimen Buddhismus, the structure of visual expression in esoteric Buddhism. It investigates the structural logic of visual expression in esoteric Buddhism, foregrounding the internal grammar of ritual imagery. Her co-authored volume Wegzeichen, Japanische Kult- und Pilgerbilder, turns to devotional and pilgrimage images, situating them within practices of circulation, collection, and display. In parallel, her contributions to the multi-volume series Japanese collections in European museums and related catalogues address the methodological and epistemic challenges of defining and curating Japanese Buddhist objects in European institutional contexts. The 2016 essay, Ofuda or Not, Defining a Philosophical Collection, Understanding Japanese Religiosity Through a Material Collection, sharpens this question by interrogating the boundaries of what counts as a religious object. There's many more articles that I could refer to, but I think most relevant to the talk tonight are the more recent 2004 publication, Declaring Buddhism Dead in the 19th Century, the Meiji Oligarchy and Protestant Mission in Japan, and Protest Deities and the Logic of Images, Images as Epistemic Agents in Japanese Religion. We'll follow an academic format with first a 1-hour talk and then a Q&A. Thank you also for joining us online. You can start to fill in your questions into the Q&A function as the talk goes along. And now please welcome Dr. Tomoë Steineck. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed for this warm welcome and invitation. That was such a longue durée introduction of me. It brings back memories. I'm very excited to be back in SOAS and in London. It's been a while. I have to say my topic is quite ambitious today, and I'm wondering if anybody walked in with a bit of a doubt today. I hope at least this title sparked some interest, because that was exactly my intention, and I think I can bring you over to my side in due course of the talk. I hope in the course of this lecture, I will argue that the late Edo religious images functioned as social acts of negotiation. And I don't mean these words by an abstract theory. I've already shown some Edo period images to begin with. Most are simple monochrome prints, apotropaic amulets, in Japanese ofuda or gofu, and modest altar icons for communities or domestic use. I will first walk us through the historical rise of these images from an already conflicted situation in Edo, Japan, and then I will place these images within the epistemic pressure of the 19th century Protestant mission and imperialist science. And I will ask what these historical perspectives might contribute to a visual cultural understanding of human dignity. This admittedly extensive historical background is quite necessary. It unfolds across two pre-modern trajectories, one in Japan, from the latter half of the Edo period, stretching into the Meiji era, and one in early modern Europe leading into the 19th century. Thereby, I'm closing the cycle from one question, What do the images do to the next questions? Why they're not understood in their inherent meaning today. I will also speak about the collection I'm extensively drawing from and the person of the collector, Wilfried Spinner, in some detail with emphasis on what I describe as his decision of tolerance in a situation of conflict. This is leaning on the German philosopher Rainer Forst's book, Toleration in Conflict. One central icon that will accompany us is the Kai-Un-Myoken Bosatsu you're seeing right now at the sanctuary of Kiso Ontake, so the Myoken who guides to better fortune. And he embodies literally all of the aspects we're going to talk about today. And this scroll and many others have already been published in my last exhibition, Fabio kindly referred to, which took place in 2014 at the Ethnographic Museum of the University of Zurich. And you can also look many of them up in the database we've been building at the Japanese Studies Department in Zurich in cooperation with the Hosei Daigaku in Tokyo. I will also introduce my concept described as visual vocality, which I use to capture these epistemic contents of the images. I hope this framework and method I offer can speak beyond the historical cases I present today. And for this, I will sketch a blueprint that may prove useful for thinking about contemporary conflicts across many cultural contact zones. Now, we first need some working definitions. Who belongs to this group I will refer to as commoners all the time. I'm using the term as a practical social category, leaning on Yasumaru Yoshio's use of the marketplace as a social lens. The people who mix in everyday economic and urban life, this is where Yasumaru uses the marketplace as a snapshot to capture the group of people who mingle there, the minshu in Japanese. I narrow Yasumaru's snapshot further down to the middle and working classes, all who are not part of the ruling elite, cutting out the daikan, the matsubugyo, and lower-ranking samurai and similar. So for our purpose today, commoners refers to a social group that is firstly structurally remote from legislative and epistemic authority, and therefore historically subject to regulation. They're not self-defining in official discourse and excluded from significant decision-makings. Taking this further, I connect to the terminology proposed by Ian Reader, common religion, for what is usually called popular religion. This would be my translation of the word minshu shukyo in Japanese. The ko is another key structure here. What grew out of Buddhist devotional sermons in the Nara period later took roots in selected groups responsible for local kami worship in villages, responsible for the enshrining of deities like the Ubusu-Nagami, and were adopted by commoners as a semi-formal associations organized around communities or occupations or gender or age in the Edo period. And I need to stress that we need to be careful in translating this term ko because confraternity is a gender-biased word, which is exclusively masculine. You can use that if it's masculine groups, but the Japanese kos are very often gender neutral or even female only. Now, the ko were centered on shared devotion, but the equally structured everyday life, like coordinating festivals and rituals, pooling funds for pilgrimage, or also everyday life, providing mutual support, also mental support, and shaping group identity. So they were supporting pilgrimages, chapels, icons, and image circulation as well, effectively creating grassroots religious publics in which people negotiated their authority, belonging, and visibility. In that sense, their religious identity was never the whole story of the ko, and they operated as layered social formations. And recent scholarships, like at the Komazawa Daigaku, finally acknowledges this historical fact. And crucially, they functioned outside strict institutional control, which allowed commoners to shape their own access to religiosity. Now, dignity is the central term today. So I want to approach it twofold. First, indirectly, by asking, when do we need to speak of a loss of dignity in a community or for a person? And I would propose it's when a person or a group is violated directly through physical violence, loss of life, livelihood, or bodily harm, and including secondary epistemic discrediting after natural disasters, which is very important for Japan. Or when a group is violated in respect and social standing through epistemic exclusion. Third, when a person or a group is excluded from decision-making in the wider social context, thus rendering subordinate to decision makers. Now, before I define how dignity that has been thus violated can be restored, I want to take a look at the next term, passivity. Now, epistemic exclusion or denial of attention works through the ascription of passivity to a certain group or person. In cultural political debates, passivity, however, is not a neutral term. It's narrative construction, and it prepares the ground for intervention and a supposed need for guidance of this group or person. Now we get to the dual term invisibilization and visibilization. It's a bit of a tongue breaker in English, but they're the equivalent to the Japanese terms fukasika and kasika, which is also closer to the field of visual cultural studies. So I would like to stick with this couple for today, trying not to break my tongue in due course. The next term, modernity. By this, I don't simply mean a historical period, but a classificatory framework, one that defines what counts as rational, civilized, or progressive and legitimate knowledge, often by privileging text and reason while marginalizing embodied and visual forms of religiosity today in a global context. This is also not far off to call it an apparatus after the Foucauldian sense. In addition, modernity is entangled with time strategies because it's always looking to the future, it's always looking forward. It's a drive towards the future that dominates politics and value systems in a society, and it's a design the majority or the ruling dominant party has decided is good for the future of all of them. And whoever or the group that falls out of this design is cancelled out or made invisible. Following the discourse on the different types of modernity that has been taking place in the last 20 years, we should think of the historical case that I'm introducing in Kiso in Japan as situated modernity, and the globally dominant definition simply modernity for today. That there are several ways of changing these asymmetrical situations that passivity, making invisible, or modernity describe. But the result should always be reaching a dialogical leveling. This means restoring the possibility of being recognized as a speaking visible presence. This accepts the agency of the other to speak or represent and define their own needs. Hence, I want dialogical not understood in a casual sense, but in the Greek meaning of dialogos. When we intervene in processes of making invisible and recover suppressed agency, we attain dialogical leveling and recover dignity. Therefore, dignity is upheld when a group's testimony is recognized again, when their identity or voice or opinion and expression of needs or rights are made visible again. So this is where I would first bring in the term visible voices. Visibility here is often literal through the reversal of delegitimization of and recovery of the logic of images upheld by the group. And we will come to see that images often dismissed as simplistic or naive in today's popular and also academic contexts, labeled idolatry or uneducated can instead be understood as a quite politically charged agent and socially powerful expression. Expression of who is then the question. Let's move straight into the historical ground. We're in the 18th century in central Japan, focusing on the sacred mountain Ontake, which is shown here as the big white triangle. Near the Kiso Kaido stretch in the center of the Nakasendo route, you can see the Kiso Kaido stretch with purple dots and Kyoto and Edo on each side. The landscape itself is visually quite familiar from many depictions of the Edo period. Mount Ontake, or Ontake-san, appear in several bookbook prints by Hiroshige and Eisen, the Nakasendo series. And views from stations like Narai or Yabuhara or the well-known Magome are familiar to us, and especially those who love the Furikake by Nagatanien. Now, Magome is also the setting of Shimazaki Toson's 1929 novel Before the Dawn, Yoake Mae. And this is the heartland of the Ontake movement I'm going to talk about. Kiso Ontake's case shows quite clearly that this is not just a socio-economic periphery, but also a geographical one, adding to the significance or the power, the weight of the center-periphery dynamic. Ontake-san is also described by the missionary and mountaineer Walter Weston in 1896 in his volume Mountaineering and Exploration in the Japanese Alps, where he quite vividly recounts the Ontake-ko spirit procession rituals on the mountain. Now, since at least the late Kamakura period, Ontake has been revered within medieval Shugendo networks around the Kiso region. The lack of written records prior to the early modern era make it very difficult to say anything for certain before that. So if I say the late Kamakura period, this is a very, very careful estimate. Nevertheless, by the early modern period, Ontake was certainly a very powerful holy mountain, but rather a local and tightly restricted one. Local meaning the knowledge about this holy place didn't extend beyond local regions. What kind of restrictions are we talking about here? For us, the important fact is access restrictions. Access actually required the Ju-Kessai ritual, which is a severe regime of purification and austerity lasting up to 100 days. And it demands strict separation from non-purified people. And I'm talking about you cannot use the same cooking fire. You have to use a sacred purified fire to make your own food. And of course, you cannot join into the same diet regime as your fellow villagers. So this would be absolutely unattainable for normal working people. On top of this, ascent was permitted only once a year on the 14th of June. The 6 months. And fees were also charged, meaning that in practice, only professional and pretty well-off Shugenja could gain access in the first place. The Kiso valleys were also protected forestry zones of the Owari domain, adding an economic motive to the access restrictions. Now, 2 shrines are traditionally enshrining the deity of Ontake. Institutionally, one of the 2 shrines on the flanks, the one at Kurosawa village, you can see the 2 shrines in the orange circle. The Kurosawa village is the one at the very right. It held the near exclusive access rights to the holy peak. Backed by its elite genealogy traceable to the Suwa Taisha priests and institutional authorities such as Yoshida Shinto, the Kurosawa village shrine was ruling practically on its own. The other path associated with the shrine at Otaki village had very limited recognition and access rights. Kurosawa is also the lineage that was granted the right to use the title of Ontake Daigongen in the first place. Otaki was not. So even though both are official shrines, there is another institutional asymmetry at play already here. And I'll call for ease of the talk, these two shrines, just Kurosawa and Otaki shrines today. And within roughly a decade between 1782 and 1794, three realities would dramatically turn and transform the situation in Kiso, resulting in the emergence of the popular movement, which is the association of Ontake-ko. First is the Tomoë famine, 1782 to 1788. It brought large regions of Japan to the brink of collapse, and the rural Kiso region was also severely hit. And communities there began petitioning for direct access to the local sanctuary, the Kiso Ontake-san, as a last hope for survival. What does that mean then? There is no food on the top of the mountain, so what they were seeking was to regain normality and dignity amidst possibly the worst crisis of their life, by addressing their suffering directly to the powerful deity of Ontake. So they didn't want any intermediates anymore. Second, this movement was spearheaded by one Kakume Gyoza, a self-taught religious practitioner, and effectively the leader of a protest march against institutional gatekeeping of the sanctuary of Kiso. Now, third, a successor to Kakume, Fukan Gyoza, transformed Kakume's intervention into a supra-regional movement, which then became the Ontake-ko. In a bit more detail, Kakume began petitioning for light austerity access with the Kurosawa Shrine in 1782, so fairly pretty on in the Tomoë famine. This was denied, as we can all imagine. He then still led a group of around 80 villagers up the Kurosawa route and was imprisoned for 3 weeks. And the villagers who joined in this protest were also punished to varying degrees. And this act was far from universally welcomed at that time, with many villagers and especially local headmen, so the higher you go up in the social ladder, strongly opposing the break with tradition. Kakume's second ascent in 1785 is regarded as the decisive opening of the sanctuary, and then that would be the moment light austerity pilgrimage became a reality. So you can go and speak to the deity of Ontake without this 100 days severe austerity. And the sanctuary opened to commoners. But Kakume and his followers repeatedly faced persecution and sabotage to achieve this, and even broke legal codes. This aspect makes these ascents not a reform from within institutions, but a challenge from outside of the system. So it is actually a ritualized protest. Several points are important when reading these events as protest march. First, the leading figure was a self-taught ascetic of humble origin, meaning without elite background. So there was no elite religious institution involvement at all. Two, he first followed official petition channels. So it's not an Ikki uprising. He was trying to negotiate through the given channels, echoing parts of local village demands with the rising famine crisis. Three, a group of commoners joined him and climbed without permission, so it makes a group, effectively forcing access against authorities of institutions, as well as the ruling Owari domain. So they're up against two big players. Kakume died during an ascent in 1786, pretty much right after it was successful, and did not consolidate the movement. And in comes his successor. In 1792, Fukan was invited by a devotee to attempt an ascent via the still restricted Otaki route. So the Kurosawa route was opened by the first Gyoza. By then, 1792, Fukan had already opened other mountains to lay pilgrimage, which you can show here, see here in the chart. And ascending yet again up Ontake without permission, he effectively followed in Kakume's footsteps of protest. When the Kurosawa authorities learned of this event, that somebody is breaking the code and going up the Otaki route, even though it's the other route, they appealed to the domain magistrate, which is the Daikan, and who ordered the Otaki route barricaded. And against all these odds, 2 years later, 94, is historically acknowledged as the opening year of the Otaki path. And Fukan is recorded to have enshrined the Shimbutsu, deities and Buddhas, at multiple points along the ascent, so while he was going up the mountain, sacralizing the route itself, but he did so departing from the old sacred geography and layering onto it. Now, at this point, what he's doing, we enter the realm of establishing new sanctuaries, empowering new icons, and de facto changing the religious landscape as well as its concept. Fukan not only went up without permission, he changed the sacred geography of Ontake. Now, this map, published in 1880, shows the 3 mountain peaks that are among the most renowned sanctuary openings by Fukan, which is the Mikasayama, first 1790, and the Hakkaisan, 1794, which he then places into the sacred geography of Mount Ontake. You can see here Mikasayama on the left and Hakkaisan down below on the right. So there are 3 mountain peaks and 3 mountain deities unified in one. And of course, these mountains were far away. Hakkaisan is in Niigata, nowhere near Nagano. So this map, therefore, can be seen as reflecting the rearrangement of the sanctuary after 1794. This is important because it shows that communal movements did not only produce devotion, like going to the temple, paying their dues and worshiping, they produced new sacred geographies. Now, when movement gathered momentum under Fukan, further elements become clear, and I'm going to list up 5. First, the religious leader is a professional this time. Fukan was a trained Shingon Shugenja, and though he was not elite, he was of a higher status and had professionally trained knowledge. Second, he opened multiple mountains, which means he established a broader pattern of democratizing mountain sanctuaries. 3, he reshaped sacred geography, repositioning enshrined deities and Buddhas along the route. 4, he established new rituals, including the spirit invocation practices of ozadate, later described by Western. And ozadate is a type of kami oroshi or kami yori, which is only done in Ontake. So it's a very specific Ontake type ritual. So rather than producing doctrines for the devotees, which he never did, he created a multi-sensory religiosity built on pilgrimage, ritual, and divine presence, providing commoners the opportunity to directly experience the holy at the sanctuary, which was pretty much exactly what the villagers sought in the beginning. Now, the entire chain of events between 1782 and 94 is crucial. First, the rupture of the famine crisis, then the intervention by Kakume and the consolidation by Fukan. This all happens very quickly. With Fukan's breakthrough, it turns into a movement. And if we recapture what began as a protest, becomes fully consolidated religious formation with networks, rituals, and new icons. And importantly, it's not the inherited icon of an existing sanctuary. He didn't erase all of it, but the creation of a new sacred order. Taken together, these stages anchor what started as a protest into daily routine. The intervention stabilizes not through violence, which is an important point here, but through continuity with the traditional ways of establishing sacred legitimacy by negotiating. And this is where the mechanism matters, because sacred authority is not claimed abstractly. It follows a recognizable structure. In other words, it's a knowledge you can attain. By following the sequence, commoners effectively appropriated the traditional mechanism of sanctuary formation. They're not inventing something alien. They're using the same patterns, which has always been established, let's say, since the Heian period at the latest. And this is not copying, it's an appropriation of knowledge. This changes the social position they are standing dramatically by anchoring rights at this level, that somebody who is leading their group is changing an entire sanctuary and the religious geography. They become part of it, not only as devotees, but as participants in how the sacred is recognized and inscribed thereby their existence into the memory of the place. And this is, I think, where dialogical leveling really begins. Not through confrontations with the first protest, mind you, that was necessary, but through acknowledged presence and the durable inscription of themselves into the sacred place. So now we're speaking of image production, finally. Let's look at one of the most typical examples of the ontakeko, the ontake shindei scroll. I'm sure most of us have seen something like this before, the visualization of a sanctuary, whether you call it mandala or not. This is quite a standard format. At the top of this particular mandala of the ontakeko, we can see a triad, the deities of the mountain, which is at the top, Ontake-san Zao Daigongen, then Hakkai-san Daizura Shinno, and Mikasayama Toriten, the deities that are the emanation of the mountains, Fukan, opened for the public. And little lower, we see the deified Fukan Reijin himself, who is already enshrined in the universe of Ontakeko. Now, this represents the new sanctuary configuration that emerges from Fukan onwards. Let's take a brief look what Fukan changed for the Ontakeko. The Shugendo protector deity Zao Gongen is a standard enshrined deity on mountain tops in Shugendo. He is equated by Fukan to Kuni no Tokotachi no Mikoto as a kami. While the established Ontake shrines controlling the Kurosawa path first traditionally equated the Daigongen to Anki Daibosatsu, this is a local specific Kiso region canon. You will not find this canon in another region. And the Honji was Shokanon. The Otaki shrine venerated the deity as Iwato Gongen and equated him to Onamuchi no Mikoto, with the Honji being Juichimen Kannon, the 11-headed Avalokiteshvara. Now, Kuni no Tokotachi no Mikoto, perceived by Fukan as one of the first-generation kami, as we know, ranked much higher than Onamuchi, and both Honji disappeared in Fukan's text. Instead, Fudomyo becomes important as a figure who appears to Fukan in the mountains. So the pantheon is largely rearranged here. It's also made more grand. And then is increasingly this is increasingly reflected in printed amulets of the Otaki shrine in the early decades of the 19th century. So the shrine, Otaki, that existed way before the protests began, therefore began to match their amulets, their issuing and printing, to the rearrangement of the Ontakeko universe. We're speaking of a shift of an entire religious universe within 10-20 years. The monochrome and mounted paintings you can see here, preserved by an active Ontakeko, the Takahari Shinganko from Nagoya. And on a side note, many of these Ontakeko are still vibrantly active today. They have websites you can visit online. The monochrome version in their collection is believed to be conceived by the student of Fukan, Wada Magohachi, who was a first-generation lay devotee, who later became the co-leader Myogaku in Kozan. In other words, we're looking at an image possibly created by a commoner who rose to a religious leader, and both represent a newly created icon reflecting the rearrangement by Fukan, even a reinvention by Fukan, for the common movement of Ontakeko. One notable detail you might have noticed of the central painting is the brocade mounting bearing the Tokugawa crest. This suggests that the ruling authority eventually leaned into the movement rather than suppressing it. The drawing on the right part is now part of the Spinner collection in Zurich at the Ethnographic Museum, belongs to a group of religious drawings, of which 2 carry the seal of the Kan-Eiji atelier Kandasote. Originally an elite workshop producing icons for high-ranking temples and Tokugawa court context, of course they were Kan-Eiji atelier, they later faced economic pressure and began accepting commissions beyond its traditional patronage networks. Now, this creates an intriguing constellation because the brocade mounting and the drawing both point to an elite production environment. And yet what they visualize in their painting is a sacred order that was initiated from below. So we're not looking at a commoner imagery sidelined in history outside of the institutional pantheon. And we can support this shift further because by Tempo 3, 1832, the Otaki shrine built a new okunoin, a chapel on the flanks of Ontake, enshrining the co-deities alongside the older Shimbutsu of the mountain. That is a clear sign that institutional actors were no longer simply resisting the movement, they were incorporating it. Now, to understand what happens next, we need to look at the structure of these devotional prints more generally. How sacred power is made portable, how iconography is stabilized, and recognition works at a glance. That structure is what allows images to travel and different groups to claim a place within the sacred landscape. So for this purpose, I've got a small drawing attributed again to the Kanda, showing this mechanism quite well. You can see it's a very rough sketch in it's not finished image, but a work in blueprint. But I think we can see clearly what it will become in the end. It shows Benzaiten seated in the center. Above it reads Enoshima Hongu Iwaya, one of the 3 major Benzaiten sites in Japan. This shows Kanda ateliers typically produced images for large established sanctuaries, like the Enoshima. These drawings were templates for printed amulets, ofuda, that circulated widely from their ateliers. What's important here is that these amulets, this one and any other one, follow a stable visual order, which means at the center is the figure in a recognizable iconography, never generic, and that iconography encodes the specific power of a living devotional image as a particular sanctuary. Around the figure, the layout usually includes the temple name at the top, benefits on the sides, and sometimes the location at the bottom, like an address of the sacred power. The more famous the sanctuary, the less text is needed. The stronger the power of the hierophanic figure, the more unique the iconography becomes. And ultimately, the image alone is enough for recognition, like in the case of, say, the Zenkoji amulet. So even the simplest amulets operate within this shared visual system. Whether elite atelier or common print, they play on the same visual fields, but it also means they can use the same grammar of legitimacy. Now, so far, we've stayed close to leadership, either a lead workshop or a major core authorities like the leader himself or his direct disciple. What does visual agency look like on the ground, further down on the social ladder? This brings us finally to our Kai-un Myoken Daibosatsu. This Myoken core icon is mounted as an altar image, but structurally it follows the format of an amulet. Central figure fixed within the frame of identifying text, the upper inscription naming the deity and specifying its location in Kiso Ontake. The lower section, the inscription on the pedestal, naming the donating body, which is an Edo Kagura-ko. Now, through a Hosei University colleague I'm affiliated with, I was able to confirm with an Ontake historian directly that a corresponding statue to this image actually exists on the lower flanks of the mountain. Locally, it wasn't identifiable in detail, apparently because the inscription on the lower part is missing. In that sense, the Zurich print can return missing specificities to the site in Japan. So bottom line, there is a statue in a chapel on the flanks of Ontake, which exactly corresponds to this icon. What we see here is an adoption across media, three-dimensional icon at Ontake rendered into a portable two-dimensional format. The same goes for the main triad of Ontake, for the Amida Sanzon at Zenkoji, etc., etc. So there's never only the circulated image on print. There is always a source, a three-dimensional statue, that is regarded as the manifested holy. And that's the larger point here, because core networks donated chapels, commissioned icons, and circulated prints. But these are not only devotional acts. They didn't do it for another institutional body. They followed established structure and made their own image. And this image became a visible voice for their presence. And anchoring it to the level that institutional actors actually leaned into it, not rejected it, it became a lasting voice. Now, the image is a claim to access and legitimacy, as we see here in the Kai-un Myoken, and a testimony of the successful negotiation the Ontake-ko had done in the 40, 50 years prior to this icon being printed. Now, the Kiso Ontake-ko in general, and more specifically this Kagura-ko Myoken, exemplifies this act of social negotiation by use of images on the commoner level. They stabilize iconography, anchor narratives, and circulate images for legitimacy, sometimes even naming the devotees themselves, which is, by the way, a traditional element on donated icons since India in Buddhism. And that is what I mean by visual vocality. And it matters for dignity today because it shows smaller core communities actively placing themselves into the sacred geography of the mountain, then extending their presence outward through prints, circulating them. Now, if dignity depends on recognition within a dialogical field, on a dialogical level, then the production of sacred images becomes a way of claiming that status against institutional authorities. And this is visual agency of a commoner in action. I want to quote Yasumaru Yoshio here once again. He makes an important observation. He argues that pre-modern commoners rarely left records of their own inner world. Most historical sources describe them from the outside. What popular religion changed was not only belief, but expression. It created new channels through which commoners could articulate emerging forms of self-awareness. Quote closed. Anyone familiar with subaltern discourse, like the well-known paper by Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak?, will recognize that Yasumaru is pointing out exactly the same thing. Can the subaltern speak? How do they speak? This is exactly where visual vocality comes back in for me. Visual culture becomes a space where commoners did not merely receive religion, they express themselves within it. That is, of course, until the image is discredited. So let me shift the lens to Europe. If we want to understand why these images we've just seen later became so easily forgotten, in other words, rendered invisible, we have to look at the knowledge regime that trained people to distrust them. This happened at home in Japan and abroad, which is the West, Europe in our case, but as I focus on the Swiss missionary, we examine the European history closer and not the Japanese one. This is where the dignity question actually sharpens, because what counts as proper or dignified religion is shaped by long histories of classification. There are histories that decide which media counts as knowledge and which don't. So before we turn to Spinner, I want to sketch a short genealogy of Protestant mission as a knowledge project of modernity in their global expansion. Now, originally, mission was not a Protestant priority. Would you believe that? After the Reformation and even after the 30 Years' War in Europe, theologians did not treat mission as an ongoing task because the apostolic mission was framed as already completed in biblical times. Speaking of St. Paul. Early Protestants focused on reforming Christianity from within rather than exporting it. Now that changed in the late 17th century with figures like Gottfried Leibniz. Protestant mission begins to be envisioned against the global dominance of Catholic empires, especially in relation to China, because this arose within the China rights controversy time. But for Leibniz, mission is never only theological. Of course, he's a politician, he's a diplomat, he's an intellectual. It is diplomatic, economic, and a geopolitical competition. Leibniz drafts the first strategy for Protestant mission, coupling science exchange with conversion. And this is already a progress project. At the same time, Protestant culture and theology carries a structural suspicion of images, which is fairly well known. Horst Bredekamp, the German art historian, calls this a Platonic aversion against images. Images become linked to idolatry, while truth in Protestant universe is aligned with text, reason, and interior belief. Yet images don't stop mattering even in the Protestant discourse. If anything, they become more politically charged because image rejection becomes one of the most crucial elements through which Protestant modernity defines itself. By the late 18th century, European thinkers increasingly rank cultures historically and hierarchically. In German-speaking world, figures such as Herder and Hegel cast world cultures as stages in a developmental arc arranged along timelines of maturity, reason, and progress. The Napoleonic invasions accelerate this process in Central Europe, certainly for the German-speaking regions. And then self-representation, intensified, becomes more important to establish an identity, as does the representation of the other. And it's constructed through contrast and contact, whether direct or mediated through publications. Mission also absorbs this omnipresent new understanding world order. Different denominations form their own mission societies, and the globe starts to be approached as something that can be mapped, divided, and assessed. And that's why mission societies standardly have a global map in their collection. The one you're seeing is created by Johannes Hesse, who happens to be father of Hermann Hesse. Now, images in this context are treated increasingly as primitive or irrational, inferior to textual systems, and it's not about the wrong image anymore, it's about images in general, altogether. So this is a very big jump from image conflicts in history. This is the point where mission is no longer only spreading faith, if it ever was such a monodimensional thing. It's producing knowledge about cultures or religion and levels of civilization and feeding the wider imperialist sciences of comparison and classification. And I'm using the word imperialist science in David Chiddester's analytic sense, mission as a driver of knowledge making under imperialist regimes. This is where new sciences such as the comparative religion, which is important to us and the mission of Wilfried Spinner, represented by Max Müller in Oxford, enters our picture. So Max Müller is called the founding father of comparative religion. He does that at Oxford University, but he is a German person. In his science, religion becomes an object of scientific classification, but foregrounding textual studies, a strong link to Orientalism. The problem is not the curiosity towards other religious systems, but their position in the teleological progress arch they still hold. And of course, that foregrounding textual studies is anchored in their ethics. It's not a method, and they don't perceive it as a method. However, missions did not uniformly adopt this scholarly framework. Now, across many of the Protestant denominations, gaps open between those who focus on individual salvation through direct contact and those who pursue a top-down strategy, which is the Jesuit strategy in China. And of course, an approach that Leibniz admired very much and called a scientific missioning. And in this shift, missionaries increasing the idea of a scientific mission in the 19th century happens to be the liberal Protestant mission who sends Wilfried Spinner to Japan. And this is characteristic for them because they later produced scholar missionaries such as Hans Haas and Emil Schiller, who then directly linked to the Chicago School of Religious Studies, to scholars like Joseph Kitagawa. And that is the knowledge structure Wilfried Spinner, our missionary, brings with him when he arrives in Yokohama in 1885. Now, I want to quickly look at when and how images are distracted and if we can actually see these kind of moments when that happens. And I'll use two examples of how European observers speak about their encounter. And we can see in their quotes that this encounter is never neutral to begin with. So they don't go in there objectively. They arrive carrying Europe's own religious conflicts, especially the Protestant suspicion of images we're talking about. I'm drawing here on German language sources only, so if you look further, there would be a much bigger archive of such examples. Now, the first one is Philipp Franz von Siebold, quite famous, author of the big volume Nippon. And in this volume, he writes that Buddhist images is not an element amongst others for him. It's a defining flaw for him. He dismisses Buddhism as a kind of picture service and suggests the teachings have been distorted since India. So the images are doing argumentative work. They become evidence of a decline of religion. So he sees images and instantly says, this is a declined religion. And he pushes this into a social classification. The image forms of Buddhism are framed by him as a religion for the lower classes. So now there's a two-class Buddhism. For sensual people, what is that? Sensual. Sensual in that period's German means people imagined as uneducated, uncivilized, and also morally suspect. You wouldn't have guessed that behind this quite normal word these days, there's such a big polemic behind that. Buddhism is not being described on its own terms at all. It's fitted into a Protestant polemical frame in which images signal superstition and excess, and simply a wrong faith. And this is the attitude that Bredekamp wants to describe with Platonic aversion to images. Siebold, by the way, is not simply projecting from Europe. And he also leans on Japanese elite evaluations he has heard already, and he states that directly in Nippon, by referring to sources that treat image manuals such as the Butsuzo Zui, which he includes in Nippon as a complete translation, as belonging to a group of lower Buddhism. So what we're seeing is a convergence of two imaginations of modernity. One is the Protestant image skepticism that meets two, a late Edo hierarchy already being constructed inside Japan, with the text-centered ideology of Fukko Shinto Kokugaku Neo-Confucianism culminating into Mitogaku. But I'm not going to go into that direction any deeper here, being at SOAS and amongst Japanese studies colleagues. Now, I want to move on to Spinner's diary entry for 16th of July, 1988. He visits several major Buddhist sites and he always talks about these sites in his diaries. Sometimes he's quite polemical, like here. He reaches for Catholic comparisons. He writes that the tone of prayer reminds him of Catholic churches and that the denominational commerce around the temples resemble Catholic pilgrimage places. So what he sees in Japan is immediately filtered through Protestant anti-Catholic categories. And the issue is not Japan at all here. It's something that in his mental world already carries the weight of the confessional history of his own faith. And when we read this kind of subtle polemic, we recognize it because the same comparison is actually still active today, often in a tongue-in-cheek register in the image world we encounter. Now, this is a beer ad in the London Tube I happened to pass by the other day. It's playful, but it depends on the same visual shorthand, Catholic-style rapture, as a legible image of embodied image-driven devotion. So we all understand this. Takes only a single moment of looking at it, and we know what this ad is about. And in both cases of these two people encountering images in Buddhist temples, it doesn't begin with Japan. Their impression does not arise from this encounter only. It begins in Europe. What travels outward with them, either with the secular person of Siebold or the missionary Spinner, is not only Christianity as a religion, but with it travels its historical baggage. And this matters for our argument, because once images are already pre-classified as corrupt, it becomes much easier to make them disappear into analysis or deny it dignity in our terms. Now, let me bring this down from the level of theory to concrete case study and one very concrete archive. I want to turn to Wilfried Spinner now and to the collection he left behind, which is in Zurich. You can see Spinner here in the center with Minami Hajime and other of most of his main students. And if I say I want to speak about the collection he left behind, I mean it quite literally, because it sat for years in the attic of his family home, basically forgotten. And his granddaughter told me about her adventures, how she used to open the boxes when she was small in the attic and marvel at these images that were so different from what she knew in Switzerland. They were only donated to the museum in the 1980s. So where does this collection come from that was hidden in the attic for so long? Within weeks of arriving in Japan in 1885, Spinner begins to assemble amulets, altars, and altar icons, small statues, and other portable ritual objects. So it's not only images, it's not only printed two-dimensional objects, but also three-dimensional objects in the collection. And he's unusually brief about what he's doing. He just notes a single line in his diary that these are foundations for the study of religious history. Grundlagen für religionshistorische Studien. This is on 24th November 85, so barely 2 months after his arrival. What matters even more is how he builds this collection. And this is not a pantheon in the abstract like the Butsuzo-Zui, which is, by the way, the basis of the Gimei collection, where deities mostly appeared in isolated types. Spinner assembles devotion as it actually works on the ground because he tracks the landscape of sanctuaries. He tracks pilgrimage routes. And that is where Minami Hajime's role becomes crucial for the collection. Minami is in his own right quite famous philosopher and Protestant activist of the Meiji period. And he is clearly for the collection not just the person who acquires the objects. He's the one who's explaining what matters, which shrines and temples carry weight for the Japanese worshipper, which Reijo sanctuary structures and practices and movements Spinner has to pay attention to. So the result is that the collection maps the sacred geography with surprising care. It gathers main sites and worship constellations around Benzai Ten and Inari, all the three major sites, the Sandai, you call in Japan, and it reaches across the major sanctuaries of Edo and Kyoto. He has Asakusa, Sensoji, he has Seiryoji in Arashiyama, and almost programmatically covering different schools and modes of worship. And it also, what Spinner encounters in his everyday life as common as religion. And in light of icon-aversion we've been talking about, it's meaningful that these images of humble origin are not dismissed as religion for sensual masses. So Spinner does have larger icons. For instance, like the Amida icon of the Jodoshu, huge paintings, or the Juroku Zenshin, dated to 1603, but I'm only showing numerous items here. So by training and temperament, Spinner is an icon-averse Protestant, should be. And yet he collects images, not as a parade of the exotic, which has happened often enough. For instance, with the Basel Missions Africa collections, which is very problematic. He doesn't collect it as aesthetic curiosities. He's not interested in high art, but it's more a scholarly focus. And the empirical method is quite rare for his period. And there's a background to this decision-making, which I want to quickly look into if I have enough time. But I would like to ask for the time.
Yes. 5
more minutes? Okay.
or 7.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very good to know. So, talking about Spinner, let's keep this brief. So we already said Spinner belongs to a lineage of mission-trained scholars. He's first and foremost a scholar, right? He's a missionary, but he was trained as a scholar. He has 3 PhDs, philosophy, theology, and I think language. And he is in the lineage of quite well-known missionary scholars, like Hans Haas, and actually he should be the first, but he's oddly overlooked. On his way to Japan, he visits Max Müller, who is the founding father of religious studies. He is not only in personal contact with Max Müller, but Max Müller is also the patron of his mission. So this is heavily anchored in European intellectual and academic world. And this all speaks against him assembling such a collection. But of course, the first thing he does when he arrives in Japan is he starts to collect images. What's that? This is completely against the instinct of an icon-aversion Protestant. And there are 2 more telling moments. First, he publishes a very critical note about his own mission back home in the German-speaking region in Weimar at that time, which doesn't sit well with his mission, not surprisingly. He does that very early on in the first year of being in Japan. He already gets into trouble with his employers because he criticized them publicly. And second, he writes in his diary that he resists a donation-driven genre of mission reporting. So mission reporting is something that regularly appears in bulletins back home in Europe, and it's expected to depict the mission territory in a very poor manner, portraying it as a moral disaster or romanticizing it or highlighting the terrible situation on hygienes and people dying. This is actually not just unimportant storytelling, but it generates money for the missions back home in Europe, and it leads to lasting images that we inherit still today about regions like Africa and Asia. So Spinner doesn't want to write about romantic Japan or the moral degeneration of sake-drinking Japanese. There is already a background for Spinner's decision that we will look into next, which is out of this tension that I call decision of tolerance, he stops publishing. He doesn't want to publish anymore. I've shown the quote first when he came to Japan. Maybe I should go back for a quick moment. When he came to Japan, he was thinking about writing 5 books. Then he's reducing as time passes. And in the end, he says he can't write anymore because he doesn't really understand what Japan is about. But this is a very scholarly attitude. He doesn't jump to quick judgment, which are usually sweeping judgments, and aligns with diagnosing exotic or foreign cultures for the imperialist sciences and the mission publications at home. And in the second quote, Spinner points out a Eurocentric dismissal and romanticizing projection, which is Orientalism. And this is one of the rare quotes that somebody in the 19th century is actually noticing, even at least a bit, that there is a problem in both of these structures. So what happened to all this then, Spinner's thoughts and the collection? Why was this almost lost and forgotten? Spinner's intervention matters because imperial classifications don't simply describe people. They produce them as objects of knowledge. And once repeated, these classifications, they travel and it hardens into common sense, as we can all experience today. Replication is not neutral. It keeps an imperialistic epistemic order in circulation. So it's important to stop that circulation at some point. This is why I dare to speak of a tolerance when Spinner stops publishing. He refrains from judgment and stops circulating this information, which he cannot align himself with, because what he sees on the ground in Japan, it doesn't fit the theories he brought from Europe. After that, Spinner distances himself completely from mission activity for the rest of his life. He's not publishing, nor making the collection public. But this is where visual culture becomes unusually strong for conflict studies, because when written archives that Spinner felt that he has to stop replicating are creating conflicts, it's actually a good angle and a moment to intervene for visual cultural studies to step in and raise archives that are non-textual. Images are not illustrations of a theory, not just illustrations, I should say, and they're locations where conflicts over legitimacy or recognition and authority become visible, often in ways that textual paradigms smooth over. If we treat images as social action, we get a method for grounded historical research and recover evidence that forces us to review what we thought we knew or to review the textual sources. So evidence before verdict and recognition before ranking. And for that, I think visual cultural studies is exceptionally well placed. Of course, I would say you have to follow dignity as an analytical commitment. And this is my answer to today's question. Visual cultural studies can contribute to human dignity by treating images as visual voices, by recovering evidence of how communities made claims and negotiated powers. And this approach travels everywhere. This is not only based in Japan, and I'm not speaking about cultural essentialism in Japan, but Japanese history and visual culture also offer meaningful ways of thinking forward about modernity or dignity for that matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an incredibly rich paper. There's so many things in there. Yes, it's hard to know where to start. I was actually thinking I'm going to ask a question about recognition, then about access, then about dignity. You sort of brought it around at the very end. But I was wondering about the idea of the image or icon-averse Protestant collecting images. That never appeared to me as a contradiction, because, you know, as Bruno Latour writes of the iconoclast, it is actually the iconoclast who is the person who actually believes in the image, right?
Yeah.
They say no, this is all terrible, but actually the act of destroying is the most visceral evidence that, you know, there is actually something there that needs to be excised, some kind of presence. So I thought that was really interesting, how Spinner, then he goes silent and he sort of says, well, or maybe he wanted the collection to speak for itself. But let me ask you, so the dignity, also at the beginning I was thinking your argument about dignity was about the dignity of the people who make these claims, but it seems to me now that you're speaking about the dignity of the image itself. So it's a restitutive sort of retro project to restore the dignity that once there was, and through that to think about maybe the dignity of the people that were involved in making and circulating them. Is that roughly?
I would say it's really hard to disconnect the two. The image carries the agency of the people. There's a logic behind it, and it operates in this universe of people who know the code.
Right.
So if you come from the outside and you don't know the code, of course you don't know what this is about. But if I would go to Australia or to Indonesia, I wouldn't know the visual codes they use. But I can, if I have this knowledge of one example, I can at least presume that there might be a logic behind it. This is the first step of getting into a dialogical level,
right,
and trying to respect images as holders of logic. It could be a holder of logic.
Right. So you work then back from the dignity of the image towards the dignity of the people. Okay. Oh, it's a fascinating process.
Yes, it was actually quite interesting because I was speaking to Professor Yama, who is leading the Institute for Disaster Recovery at the Kansei Gakuin Daigaku. And we were, of course, talking about contemporary disasters, earthquakes, most of all. And I was giving him a paper about images that people create after the disaster. And these images are never images of the disaster. And there's already a center-periphery tension because the center produces images of the disaster. So this is news reports. The community that suffered this disaster and that wants to recover doesn't hold on to images of the disaster. They create an image of recovery. And it's very often religious, and it's very often tied to something that was before, meaning a traditional imagery. So that in that way, I was, this is the line along which I was thinking about this historic cases. So I'm actually working backwards from today to the Edo period.
Right. Thank you very much. Right, we'll open it up to the floor. Who wants to go first? Yes, please.
Thank you. Rich, lots of new areas. I have a very general question, I suppose, to draw back from the Ontake case study. Is it unusual? Is it even unique, this idea of forging a new path, literally, to the sacred beat as a protest, the unauthorized actions? Are there other records of this, or is it completely special in that sense?
I think, well, if you start, you possibly have to start with Ontake, because while it was not a commoner's thing to do, this was established method of opening new sanctuaries. I mean, Kobodashi Kukai did that with Koya-san and so on and so on. But that was acknowledged by the authorities. The important thing is, of course, you have to make it public. You have to spread the knowledge about this encounter with the holy. And then you communicate and establish that kind of organized map to bring it to the attention of the ruling elite, who would then try to gain benefits from the encounter with the holy that this specific religious specialist opened for them. But if you're talking about protests, there are protest deities much earlier in the history, which I'm going to publish about, hopefully before summer. Depends always on the editor. And protest deities have been recorded in medieval sources like the Hyakurensho. And it's always deities that come from the outside. And it's always upheld by the lower classes. So there are notions that the Inari is such a deity which is appropriated very often. There are agricultural local deities that are appropriated for this purpose. And actually contemporary working class people also rely on religious protests. For instance, on the coasts of northern Japan, Hokuriku, fishermen stage protests by piling up their buckets if they don't want to go out to sea. It's a protest against worldly authorities, so not the weather, if they can't go out to sea. And they say, this is a kami, they can't take this apart for 3 days. And nobody can do anything against that because it's a ritual. But it's actually a protest.
Thank you. Okay, there's a request to type for me the question that comes in because it's hard to hear the voices in the room, so I will do that. So please excuse me from typing away here. Yes, anybody else? Yes, please, Lucia.
Thank you very much. There were a lot of interesting points you were making and also interesting material. I wondered about the commoner's image. If I can be blunt, I'm not convinced that there is a real difference between commoner images and higher Buddhas or so on. You mentioned even the Buddhas they're one next to the other. And I wonder whether that is a way of classifying that comes from lower Protestant sources, or whether you could find something like that in the material itself, for the example, we should throw it back.
Yeah.
It's there is no really such a thing. Because it's the same moment in which I don't know, and there's always A in the sense it's a specific image in a specific place becomes known for this or the other benefit. It becomes a common thing. Common in the sense that it's shared.
Yeah. Excellent point. Thank you very much for that. You are absolutely right talking about images, how these images come to be. This method is absolutely the same if it's a higher ranking priest or if it's a common religious leader. They follow the same strategy. But for instance, deities, if I speak again of the protest deities in Hyakurensho, it's a deity called Shidaragami, which is a deity completely unknown to the court in Kyoto. And it's a deity which derives from the agricultural rhymes peasants sing during their work. So this is not a generally shared deity, and it actually frightens the court quite a bit. Because they know that this is a political thing and they're marching towards the capital, upholding this deity, Shidaragami, singing their agricultural rhymes. So there are differences in the deity that are upheld at special moments.
If you talk about this protest, then I think of the monks from Hiei.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you have around. What is available. And actually, now you gave the example of this unknown entities, and maybe it was scary exactly because it was not known. But if you think of Inari was not necessarily an untouched.
Yep.
I mean, it was a very and it's represented like that also across history.
Mhm.
So how do you divide the level?
Yeah. Yeah, again, very, very good line to highlight. I think let's look at, for instance, the hayarigamis like Taro Inari of the Edo period, which kind of popped up in town and bursts into popularity of literally thousands of people going there, donating their money. And then within 6 months, it completely dies out again. Happens 3 times, always at the point of crisis. And this Taro Inari is an Inari, but then, as you say, it's a specific Inari. So you can appropriate a deity and differentiate it from this general, larger image, entity that is anchored in the proper pantheon. And by going to specifically the Taro Inari in the Edo period, people express something. They don't take their devotion and hopes and money as well to another established institutional temple. They take it to a not established temple, which then almost completely dies out, like months literally after the frenzy. The hayari is gone. So I think, there is, of course, the tradition that villagers take up. They invite deities. Let's stay with Inari. When Edo was enlarged and they were kind of working land along the coastlines to make it workable for agriculture, they were building villages, inviting the Inari from Kyoto, from the Inari Taisha, and then they make it their own village Inari, which becomes their own. It gets a new iconography of this place, and then they start printing this particular very small Edo village Inari, which is also in the Spinner collection. At that moment, it is still the Inari of Kyoto, which is also very important for the village because it's a powerful deity. But it's also a different Inari. It's their own village Inari. And I think this is a peaceful case. There was no protest involved there. But I think we have to really look at the people's intentions. And that's why I think looking into the agency of the image is actually quite important.
Thank you. Yes, Monica, please, and then we have a question online.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I was wondering to what extent did you apply Bredekamp Protestant Icon-Aversion approach to the Japanese context? This were a Eurocentric idea to a Japanese historic kind of problematic.
I came across this quote by Bredekamp when I was looking into his image science works. And of course, he talks in this particular paper, he talks about the problematic position of art history in general in Europe, because art history, according to Bredekamp, is always looked down upon by even Geisteswissenschaften, so humanities, as being a kind of a dubious discipline, never really know what they're up to. And what are they talking about images? It's just interpretation. And he says at the base of this weak standing of art history is this Protestant aversion against images itself. And I'm tracing this attitude in the European foreign visitors who come to Japan, specifically Siebold and Spinner, who actually, you don't really need to look long. They kind of express themselves pretty clearly. And the Japanese side, of course, has the icon-aversion against the Buddhist images rising from the Neo-Confucian and Kokugaku lineages. Although the Shinto schools, interestingly, they buy completely into this business of creating images at that time, but that's another story.
Thank you. So Hiromi Sasamoto Collins asks, could you tell us more about Spinner? Exactly why did he stop writing, or what kinds of experiences forced him to question the foundations of his Eurocentric knowledge? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that was a part which I kind of crammed into a brief 3 minutes. Spinner stopped writing despite of the paradigm, or let's say it was a standard manners of foreigners, especially learned foreigners, to come to go anywhere in the world, to publish fairly quickly. So another succeeding missionary after Spinner gets told, you go and write your first impressions within the first month, otherwise you'll get used to that. To that what? To that exotic absurdity that's going on that is not your home country, which is just simply different than the things that you know. So he resists this kind of trend, this kind of habit that is universal all around him. So, of course, when he goes to Japan, he's probably be told by Max Müller, go and do this study and you write about it. But he doesn't, because he can't quite be sure if it's right. And he's trained as a missionary, but he's also trained as a pastor. So he had a congregation at home, and the congregation remains to be the one important thing in Japan for him throughout to the very end. So he focuses on the people, and he focuses on the Japanese congregations of the not Christians, the other religious congregations, and he does take them seriously. And that I think is a huge difference to the other missionary who come in and treat other religious worshippers just as conversion material. So this is one point where he starts doubting about this habit of publishing, and he wants to be precise. That's you can see the precision of his work in many of his papers. I would even say all of his papers that he published. And there is no romanticizing at all in there. There is no exaggeration. And it's pretty exact, and he loves number crunching. So he writes about funerary homes in Tokyo, which is a completely boring article, to be honest with you. But it's possibly the first article written on how Tokyo City runs such institutions in 1886, you know, that kind of scientific attitude.
Thank you very much. Yes, any further questions from the floor? There is some guest called Raji Steineck would like to talk. Shall we do that?
Okay.
Hello, Raji. I think you're on now. We can hear you. Can you speak? 1 second, we'll have to up the volume, perhaps.
How?
Yes, I think we can hear you now.
Okay, great, thank you. From a more historical materialist point of view, I found the example you gave from contemporary Japan very interesting about the fishermen piling up buckets. And I wonder if these religious forms of protest that you talked about, if you can give us some idea of how that played out materially, or is it only about self-expression and pride, something like that? Or does it come with some sort of change in negotiating position about well, economical, material issues in the context of a famine and such?
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. In the case of the Kiso Ontake, I'm not aware of any protests that involves materials. I think that is owing to the situation, because against a famine, you can't put down your work and expect a situation to turn to the better. But there is actually historically seen another example, like the poetess Akazome Emon has a diary, not her poetic publications. She has a diary in which she describes, she goes to a remote place with her husband, who is ordered to be the governor there. And then her husband encounters a protest, which is in the form of a religious ritual. And in that case, the villagers are protesting against this new governor, her husband, and they stop working on their fields as peasants, and they hang up their agricultural tools around the temple, around their local temple. And then they go into this temple and they produce their claim not towards the governor, but towards the deity, towards their own Ubusunagami. And now the way the governor has to reply to this is he doesn't speak to the villagers directly, he speaks to the deity again. So he goes to their community temple, which I'm not really sure was below him, it might have been, but he goes to this community temple and then he starts speaking to the deity. So the deity is, of course, an icon, but it's at the same time a conduit through which the two parties speak. And it avoids, to a certain extent, a direct clash of opinions. And that involved, as I said, the stopping of working on the fields and the hanging up of the agricultural tools around the temple. So that was a clear sign of using economical pressure towards the governor.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Maybe one last question. We've gone over time a little bit, but given the richness of the material, it's yes, it's hard to come to terms with all of the aspects, the European parts, the historical parts, the imagery, the idea of dignity. It's really very powerful. Do you want to have a last go?
Yeah, yes, that's my first questions, but one that is more informative, maybe is more of interest, is the fact that it mentioned that Max Muller sponsored the mission of the.
No, he didn't sponsor it. He was a patron of it. He gave his name to the mission. So the mission was allowed to align with him as an Oxford professor, and of course the propagator of this new and very much in focus science of comparative religion. So Max Muller was a big name in scholarship circles at that time. And being aligned to him was prestige.
Something kind of, I'm just reminded of the not particularly positive view that Max Muller had of Japanese Buddhism.
Yeah.
Part of my that.
Yeah. It does actually, but I think Max Muller held this speech about mission at Westminster at some point, and he does speak very clearly that the not so enlightened, not so educated regions of the world do need Christian guidance. So that's what I'm also meant by this. This science of comparative religion, it's not the problem that you're curious about other regions of the world. The problem is that you bring your own ethics, which distorts the object view on these people, is destroying a communication on dialogical level, using today's terms. So I don't trust Max Muller either with his stuff.
That's a very nice place to stop.
I'm very sorry about that.
Not at all, actually. I think this is certainly a brilliant takeaway. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you also for attending online. Please look out on the website for future events. There's one more, there's a book launch planned on Okinawa on, I think, the 4th of March, and some more events coming on the 7th of March. And yes, a few other events coming up that are in planning stage as we speak. Thank you very much and have a lovely evening and goodbye.